Hello everyone, welcome to lesson 31 of our GoLang course. In this lesson, we will look at the break statement, the continue statement, labels, and the Goto statement. All these are control flow statements, or the statements that control the flow of your program. So, without wasting any time, let's get started. First up, we have the break statement. The break statement is used to break the flow of a loop, as we saw in the previous lesson. When encountered within a loop, it causes the loop to terminate abruptly even if the loop's condition is still true. The program then continues executing the code immediately after the loop. The break statement is usually used in conjunction with a if statement to define a specific condition. When this condition is satisfied, the break statement is triggered, causing the loop to exit. By combining a for loop with the break statement and appropriate conditions, you can achieve the same effect as the do-while loop. This creates a loop that will always execute at least once and then continue as long as the specified condition holds true, similar to do-while loop. Here we have an example of how a break statement is used. Here you can see we have an infinite for loop or for loop without a condition, so it will execute infinitely. Inside it, we have the condition which says if this condition is met, we break out the for loop, or this is the exit condition for the for loop. This replicates the behavior of do-while loop. So we are guaranteed to execute at least once the code block inside the for loop, and then the for loop will continue executing as long as the condition here is not true. Whenever the condition becomes true, we break out of the for loop. Let's now look at an example. First, I'm going to create a variable named a and assigning it a value of 100. Next, we are going to create a for loop which is an infinite for loop or a for loop without condition. Inside it, we will do fmt println a. Let's do a minus minus or reduce the value of a after each execution by 1. Here, I'm going to specify our if condition with the break statement. So I can do if a is equal to 90, I want to exit out of the for loop. So break. Let's run our program to see the output. As you can see, we started with 100, 99 and went up to 91. When the value of a was 91, we reduced it with 1, which means now a was 90. As such, this evaluated to true and we broke out of the for loop. This is how you execute a do-while loop with the for loop in Go. So you are guaranteed to execute this statement at least once, and then all the other iteration will depend if this condition is true or false. Next, let us look at the continue statement. The continue statement is another control flow statement in programming. When encountered within a loop, it causes the loop to skip the current iteration and immediately proceed to the next iteration. This means that any code following the continue statement within the loop will be skipped for that specific iteration. Similar to the break statement, the continue statement is typically used in conjunction with an if statement. By evaluating a specific condition, you can determine whether or not to execute certain parts of the loop's code block. When the condition is met, you can continue to bypass the code and move on to the next iteration. Here we have the syntax of the continue statement. As you can see, we defined a loop with the condition, and inside it we have the code block. Inside we have a condition to continue the iteration. The for loop will keep on executing, and if this condition is true, it continues on to the next iteration before executing anything that may be in here. Let's now look at an example for the same. So here I'm just going to create a for loop with a for clause. For I is equal to 0, I less than 5, I plus plus. Here we are going to add a condition for continue. So here we say if I is equal to 2, we want to continue on to the next iteration, and then our code block for the for loop. fmt println I. If we run the program, we will see that we print values from 0 to 4, and when we have I is equal to 2, it will continue on to the next iteration without printing the value for I. Let's run our program and confirm. As you can see, the output values are 0, 1, 3, 4. So it skipped printing when the value of I was true because we had a continue statement. Next, we are going to look at labels. The continue statement is a control flow statement that on its own only impacts the loop within which it is located. When continue is encountered, it skips the rest of the code within the specific loop for the current iteration and proceeds with the next iteration of that same loop. In situations where you have a loop inside the other loop or nested loops, the use of label provides a way to reference and control the flow of execution for specific loops. This means you can use a label with the continue statement to jump to higher level loop by passing the current loop or the inner loop. In Go, the need of labels is relatively uncommon. There are features that can be useful in certain complex or specific scenarios, but they are not commonly used in everyday programming. Most code can be written without the need for labels. Labels in Go can be associated with the break, continue, and the goto statements. This means that you can use a label to specify which loop or block you want to affect when using one of these statements. For example, you can use a label within a break statement to specify which loop you want to exit. Here is an example of labels. Here, outer is a label referencing to the outer for loop. The outer for loop has another for loop inside it, which we will call the inner for loop. And inside the inner for loop, we have a continue statement. We say if this condition is met, continue on to the outer label without executing this code block. If we didn't have a label here, when we add continue, it will just skip on the iteration for the inner code block. But here we want to skip the iteration for the outer code block, so that is why we use continue outer. That is, continue on to the outer for iteration. Let's now look at an example for labels. Here I am creating an outer loop label which will refer to our outer for block. For I is equal to 0, I less than 3, I plus plus. So this is our outer loop, and inside the outer loop we will define another for loop. For j is equal to 0, j less than 3, j plus plus. Inside it, we are going to specify the condition to continue. So we will say if I is equal to 1 and j is equal to 1, we want to continue on to the outer loop. Otherwise, we will print the values of I and j. So just to recap, we created a label which refers to the outer for loop. And from the inner for loop, we will continue on to the outer loop when the conditions are met, that is, when I is equal to 1 and j is equal to 1. So let's run our program and see the output we get. As you can see, it started with 0, 0, that is, I is equal to 0. For I is equal to 0, we execute the inner for loop 3 times. I is 0, this condition is not true, and we proceed on to printing the value of I and j, which means 0, 1. Next, we continue on to the next iteration for j, then print 0, 1 and 0, 2, so on. Once the inner loop has been executed, we move on to the outer loop again. Next time, I has now value of 1, and as such, this condition is satisfied. But to start off, j will have a value of 0, which means this condition is not true, and we print the value 1, 0. Next iteration of j, the value of j will be 1, which means this condition is true, and we continue on to the outer loop using the outer loop label. As such, all the iterations for the inner loop are skipped, and we move on to the next iteration for the outer for loop, where I is equal to 2, and we continue printing 2, 0, 2, 1, 2, 2. So that's one way of using labels. In conjunction with continue, we were able to continue the iteration of the outer for loop. If we didn't have label and we just had continue, it will just skip the iteration for the inner for loop. Next, let us have a look at the goto statement. The goto statement is a control flow statement in programming that allows you to transfer control to a specific label section of the code within the same function or block. It essentially allows you to jump from one part of your code to another. While Goto can be a powerful tool, it comes with certain restrictions in Go programming language. These restrictions are in place to maintain code readability and prevent potential issues. Let's now look at these restrictions. In Go, you are not permitted to use the Goto statement to jump over variable declaration. Don't worry if it confuses you. We will look at it with an example. Similarly, you cannot use Goto statement to jump into inner or same level code blocks. This ensures that the control flow remains structured and follows a clear path without jumping into arbitrary sections of the code, which could introduce bugs in your code. Here's an example of a Goto statement. Here we say if this condition is met, go to or jump to the end label. Anything that's inside it, that is, this code block, will be skipped and we will straight away execute this code block. When the condition is not true, both this and this code block will be executed. Now let's have a look at the Goto statement with an example. Here I have declared a, which is an integer value with value of 10. Now I am saying if a is equal to 10, go to end, which is a label that we haven't created. So let's create it. And after the end label, we print a statement saying this is the end of the program. So here I can add fmt println a. So what will happen here is, since the value of a is 10, this condition becomes true. So we use go to end, or the control flow will be transferred from here to here, and this statement will be executed, skipping this inside statement. We can run our program to verify the same. As you can see, the end of the program was printed, but fmt println a was not printed. Now, to make the if statement false, I'm just going to reduce the value of a to 9. Now, if we run the program, since this condition is never true, we don't execute goto or the jump, and as such, both the print statements should be executed. As you can see, 9 is printed along with the statement, the end of the program. Another thing I told you was that there are few restrictions when you use goto. The first one is it cannot skip variable declaration. So if I define a variable b is equal to 20, fmt println b, you can see the IDE is complaining since Go doesn't allow jump over variable declaration, which we have done here. It says go to end jumps over variable declaration at line 13, which is b is equal to 20. You cannot do that with Goto. If I remove it, it's happy with it. Now what you see here is that we have moved the end label inside a code block, or the if code block, which is at the same level as the code block that executes Goto. This is not allowed in Go, and you will get an error. You can see here it says go to end jumps into a code block, which is not allowed. And if I have another inner block inside it and then have a label, that too is not allowed. So these are two things that you need to keep in mind when using Goto. Generally, we don't use Goto much in Go programming. I think the Go team just added for backwards compatibility or for legacy reasons. That's it for the lesson. Let's now summarize whatever we have learned in this lesson. First, we looked at the break statement. The break statement is a control flow statement that allows you to prematurely exit a loop. When encountered, it immediately terminates the loop and program continues with the next statement after the loop. Then we looked at the continue statement. The continue statement again is a control flow statement used in loops. When executed, it skips the current iteration of the loop and jumps to the next iteration. This is useful when you want to bypass certain code execution based on a condition. Next, we looked at labels. Labels in Go are identifiers followed by GoLang. They are used in conjunction with break, continue, and goto statements to specify which loop or block of code to fetch. When dealing with nested loops, labels allow you to precisely control which loop you want to exit or continue, as we saw in our example. Next, we looked at the goto statement. The goto statement is a control flow statement that allows you to transfer control to a labeled section of the code. It's a powerful tool, but it's often considered a last resort and can make code harder to understand and maintain. In modern programming, you don't see the use of Goto very often. That's it for the lesson. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to comment under the video or reach out to us through our Discord server. I hope you enjoyed the lesson. See you in the next lesson. Until then, happy coding.